Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we're going to talk about Dungeons and Dragons, and we're going to talk about tabletop role-playing games. So there was a very interesting tweet from Seth Skorkowsky. Seth Skorkowsky is an interesting guy in that is adjacent to Dungeons and Dragons. In his tweet, he actually said, so let's talk about Seth Skorkowsky. So I consider him a Dungeons and Dragons YouTuber, but he does not consider himself a Dungeons and Dragons YouTuber. He talks a lot about Traveler, and he talks a lot about Call of Cthulhu. Now, the reality is, he doesn't talk about them in isolation. He almost always talks about them in context to Dungeons and Dragons, and he does a lot of. He tries to teach people how to do dungeon mastering, right? In my humble opinion, he would say game mastering. But that's the entire point of this video, is the distinction isn't real, in my humble opinion. So, but he played Dungeons & Dragons, and every time he talks about any of these other games, he always talks about them in context to Dungeons & Dragons, in my humble opinion. But he's in the middle of a moment right now. And what is his moment? His moment is he just won an Emmy for the best tabletop role-playing game podcast, right? Which is interesting because I have literally never heard a single episode of his podcast, but I've seen the majority of his, I wouldn't say the majority, I've seen many of his YouTube videos, and I still listen to his videos every now and then. Interesting guy, right? But he said something interesting on Twitter. He said, the world doesn't know tabletop role-playing games, and even now, he explained that when people want to tell people what they do as their hobby, if they play a tabletop role-playing game, they can't say to people, it's a tabletop role-playing game. And the reason why is they know, if they say, I play tabletop role-playing games, no one will have any idea what they mean. But if they say, I play D&D, they don't even have to say Dungeons & Dragons, people will know. Right? And the reason why is, after 50 years... we've arrived at a space where people know Dungeons & Dragons globally, and no one outside of... if you don't play tabletop role-playing games, you simply don't know the term. And what that really means is that in 50 years, not a single other tabletop role-playing game that Dungeons & Dragons made a global name for itself in many, many ways, right? And regular muggles who have never played Dungeons & Dragons are fully aware of what it is, okay? And fully aware of the brand name, fully aware of, and I would say aware of what it is, right? What it does. I would say what it does. Aware of what it does. How it's very distinct from other types of games, right? So it's truly incredible, right? And that's pretty astounding to, and Scott Garibay, the reason why I'm talking about it is he's a straight shooter. He says what he believes. He believes what he says. He's not trying to bend the truth. He doesn't have a massive agenda. I do think at this point he's very sour on Dungeons & Dragons, but that's not rare. There are a lot of people... And basically, if you're even remotely connected to the OSR or the indie tabletop role-playing games, you are very sour about Dungeons & Dragons. And the reason why is... every single bit of the labor that all of your designers have ever done has come to naught, right? It has not even reached the point where people know what the industry is, right? The reality is, and after 5 decades, the labors of the OSR and the indie tabletop role-playing game sphere, right? Because I don't even think it's an industry. I don't think you can actually make money in either one of, I think literally, tabletop role-playing games beyond D&D are generally vanity projects, right? And one of the reason why I continue to say this is I'm astounded. The biggest tabletop role-playing games outside of Dungeons and Dragons, that you will find on the shelves of Barnes and Nobles, right? In hardback, their main designers have a day job. It's astounding. It is truly astounding, right? I don't think tabletop role-playing games have really even created an actual industry where people can, feed their families. It is astounding how little the OSR and the indie have accomplished. And so, and I think Skorkowsky, he's saying the truth of it, right? He's like, we've reached a point after 5 decades where Dungeons and Dragons is globally known, and not one other OSR or indie has reached anyone beyond people who have already played Dungeons and Dragons, right? Like, it is truly astounding. And so why is this? Well, I think the reason we've landed here is that Dungeons and Dragons is truly completely misunderstood. And I think what's been happening is, like, there's probably a better analogy, but I'll say this one. I love tacos. I love tacos, right? And I go to any taco place and they're like, hey, do you want beef? Do you want chicken? Do you want barbacoa? What do you want in it, right? And what's been happening is in Dungeons and Dragons is real, right? Like, like you get the Dungeons and Dragons taco, and when you're done, there's something inside you. You feel like there's like something's feeding you, right? Like, like, oh my goodness, I created this world and I put it in front of people, and they're filled and I'm filled, right? As a dungeon master, I'm filled. The dungeon and performers are filled. There's protein here, right? And what's been happening is, on the OSR and the indie side, they don't give anything real. So it's the shape of the taco, right? It's the shell, but it's just lettuce and sauce. And that's it, right? And they might chop the lettuce up, they might use different types of lettuce, they'll use different sauces, but you're like, there's nothing here. There's no protein. No one can ever accomplish anything with this, right? So where do we land? I think tabletop role-playing game, because it is a useless term, should be retired, and everyone who creates or plays OSR and indie tabletop role-playing games should begin referring to their game as a board game, which is what it is. It really never accomplishes anything the way Dungeons and Dragons does. So I think, out of respect for Dungeons and Dragons, they should remove themselves from the sphere of Dungeons and Dragons and just say, we're board games. And that will be, and I think it'll be more realistic and more honest for them, because they're not doing anything of significance, right? It's just a board game, right? It's not something unique, and it really doesn't deserve the innovative title and the innovative view that Dungeons and Dragons shares. Every single word of that is my humble opinion. What's important is what I get to hear your humble opinion when you get in the comments and send your traffic. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.